Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our meeting of the Integrated Resource Planning Conversation with Southwestern Public Service Company. It's September the 13th, and we are recording this meeting for the benefit of those who'd like to listen to portions later or folks who could not be here with us today. So thank you all very much for joining us as we move to a conclusion over the next month of our facilitated stakeholder process. I'm Margie Tatro with GridWorks, and I'm joined by my GridWorks colleagues, Jay Griffin and Deborah Shields. And we're very fortunate to have our team members from Southwestern Public Service and Xcel Energy with us today. You'll hear more from them. Certainly Ben Elsey, Linda Hudgens, Zoe Lees have all been very active in this process, and we're so glad to have them and some other colleagues of theirs with us today. So our plan, just a quick reminder of what we're going to do today. We are going to review the statement of need input, and that is input both from the stakeholders and from SPS. We're going to compare, contrast, discuss those different elements as we move forward in this process. Then after a break, we will hear more from SPS on how they plan to take next steps in considering the input from the statement of need. And then we'll move to talking about the action plan. We really appreciate those of you who submitted ideas for the action plan. We are going to, again, compare and contrast the stakeholder ideas for the action plan with the input to date from SPS so that we can have a discussion about where there are common elements and maybe where there are differences. Those of you who gave us input, that will be reflected today in the presentation. Those who have not yet submitted input on the action plan, this meeting is your final opportunity to do that prior to the IRP being finalized and submitted. So we'd like to really ask for your help in clarifying where there might be questions or putting in action plan items that you hadn't yet turned in. This will be the final opportunity for that. After a break, then we'll do that compare and contrast by mapping those action plan elements, and we'll summarize our next steps and get ready for the final meeting, which will occur in early October and adjourn by 5 p.m. Quick reminder, all the materials for today's meetings are on the GridWorks website. I'll ask my colleague Deborah, when she gets a moment, to put in the chat the link to this presentation, and any other materials that get developed from today will also be loaded in there, as well as we'll have access to the recording for this meeting. Great. Next, our purpose for today really is to assess the level of agreement on the statement of need. One of the deliverables out of this facilitated stakeholder process is the stakeholder input to the statement of need, which the utility has the opportunity to respond to when they turn in their IRP, particularly if there are any items that are not agreed upon or areas of difference or similarity. Those will be allowed for the utilities allowed to comment on those when they submit the plan. I'm going to ask for your help in today's meeting. Our purpose in identifying the statement of need elements is not necessarily to come to consensus, but if there are areas where there's disagreement, we will note those, document those, and move on. We are not required to resolve areas of disagreement, but we are obligated to report those, and then the utility will comment on those when they submit their plan. So also the action plan is a very important part of the IRP. And again, thanks to those of you who've turned in ideas to the action plan, we will review those and compare those with ideas that are coming from the utility as well. So those are our key outcomes: comparing the statement of need elements and collection of the action plan ideas with an initial mapping of where there's common interest in those action plan suggestions. Just a reminder of where we are moving we're fully into the action plan phase of this process. Today's meeting will be followed by one more meeting on October 3rd to really finalize the conversation about what's in the action plan, what will not be in the action plan. Probably, I mean, there may be some changes between October 3rd and when the IRP is filed. That's up to the utility to take that action. But we decided that October 3rd would be a good time to review pieces that we have clarity on, ask any other refining questions that stakeholders might have, and really wrap up the action plan from the stakeholders' perspective at that meeting. Then the IRP is filed by the utility on October 12th or 13th or 14th or 15th. In that, the rule requires it by the 15th, but I know our utility colleagues are thinking about perhaps filing on the 12th or ominously on Friday, October the 13th, but that's when the plan will be submitted. And then we will have one final meeting of this group on October 26th to hear your input about how this process worked or didn't work for you, what things you would suggest being changed in the future for the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission to consider as they launch new IRP processes going forward. So that's our plan. I'd like to now shift to the next slide, which describes really, we're now moving to the discussion about statement of need. And this slide you've seen before, but I'd like to ask our colleague Zoe Lease to just review with everyone what is the requirement for the statement of need, what it includes. And Zoe, if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts about this, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. The rule specifies what needs to go into the utilities statement of need. NMAC 17.7.3.10 requires that the statement of need be a description and explanation of the amount and the types of new resources, including those technical resources that are to be procured. And they want that need to be expressed in terms of energy or capacity, and that's necessary to meet the level of electricity demand and the planning horizon. So that at its base is what we need to identify, basically the megawatt need that we need during the planning horizon and the statement of need. Specifically, I think for SPS, the soonest megawatt need that we need to address, as we've been discussing during this IRP, is at the end of the decade, in the 2028 to 2030 timeframe. And then the rule goes on to state that what the rule would like the commission to also consider in developing that statement of need and in doing the modeling for the statement that informs the statement of need. I don't know if you want me to go into more detail other than reading the rule, Margie, but there's just an overview of the framework that the utility must work within in developing this for the commission in its IRP.
Great, thank you, Zoe. And I'll open up to questions, but after I make one more clarification, just so folks remember, the planning horizon is defined by the PRC as 20 years. As Zoe pointed out, there are some needs that the utility has certainly by the end of by 2030, by the end of this decade, and they've gone beyond that to consider the planning horizon within the scope of the IRP, which is 20 years. So just so people can understand the timeframes that we're talking about. Are there questions that people have about the statement of need? All right, well, seeing none or hearing none, this process involves two different perspectives on statement of need. The perspective from the utility, and we'll share here just in a moment the the executive summary version, or the short version of some of the key elements of the statement of need from SPS's perspective, and we'll share the content from the statement of need interim committee, the working group of stakeholders that also put together a list of considerations and inputs to the statement of need. So we'll get to that in a moment, but our goal is to share the information from both of these perspectives and then do this compare, contrast, identify where there are agreements or disagreements, and record that so that we can then move on to the action plan. So the next slide, I'm going to invite our colleague Ben Elsley to talk through the statement of need summary that was presented during the August 29th meeting, with a lot of analysis and detail behind it. And so I've asked Ben, would you please summarize the inputs here to the statement of need from the utilities perspective, just to refresh people what the analysis results were?
Yeah, sure. And I won't go over all of the analyses and the scenarios again. I think I've probably bored everyone to death on the previous 7 or 8 meetings. But just to summarize the results, dependent upon the load forecast that we look at, and we did 3 different load forecasts, we see a need between 28 and 2030 for anywhere between kind of 4,300 megawatts to 6,600 megawatts of new renewable generation. If you recall from the results that we previously presented, it's tended to be more wind generation than solar. But when we come to issue the RFP next year, we feel like those results are going to be slightly more balanced based on a competitive solicitation. So we're kind of grouping that as just renewable energy as opposed to specific resource types. And then in addition, as we've talked about at length over the course of the prior meetings, you cannot just add wind and solar to a generation system. You also have to have some form of dispatchable, either generation or storage. So as we look at those different technologies, we've got, lithium-ion batteries. We looked at long-duration storage batteries, and then also new CTs that could potentially be converted to hydrogen. And we see that as the dispatchable need as being anywhere between 1,000 megawatts on the very, very low end, all the way up to 4,300 megawatts on the high end. And those numbers are impacted by 1, the load forecast, and then 2, the types of technologies that were available for selection. So generally speaking, if you constrain the model to only being allowed to select relatively short duration storage, you're on the upper end of the range. And then on the long duration cases, the hydrogen cases, you're on the lower end of that range. So in total, we see new generation anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 megawatts by the end of the decade, so between 28 and 30. And then just to provide some context or perspective on kind of the size of that resource need, right now, SPS has around about 7,500 megawatts of nameplate generation on the system. And of that 7,500 megawatts, approximately 2/3 is thermal generation and 1/3 is renewable generation. And that gives you a accredited capacity of about 5,400 megawatts. And our system peak is around about 4,200 megawatts right now. So I'll pause there, Margie, and see if there's any questions from anybody.
Great, thank you, Ben. Yeah, are there questions about this summary?
Margie, this is Cynthia for PRC staff. I do have one question, Ben. I was trying to match the range. I was trying to match it up to the scenarios that we looked at our last meeting or meeting before. And is this on the long duration storage scenario or what?
This is on all of the scenarios added together. So if you look across the entire range of scenarios that we modeled, this is the range between the lowest numbers and the highest numbers.
So this is the lowest scenario, lowest forecast to highest scenario, highest forecast.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And could I just do a quick check, besides Cynthia and Ed in the PRC conference room, who else has joined us there in person, please?
Agatha Malik, I'm here in the conference room as well, Marty.
Great, thanks, Agatha. Thanks for being here. Great. Okay. So the next slide, remember we talked about having the utility version of their statement of need, and we also had a stakeholder group calling themselves the Statement of Need Interim Committee, the SONIC. And that group put together a couple of page document on various elements to be considered in the Statement of Need. And my colleague Deborah will put the link to that full document in the chat in case people wanted to read it's about 3 to 4 pages of input. But one of the key elements of that was this statement from the summary of that document, which again talks to the point of how much resource needs to be added by a certain date under a variety of scenarios and with a variety of technical characteristics. At the time, the Statement of Need Interim Committee described 4 different categories of resource: new clean energy, energy from dispatchable resources, energy from storage, and demand side resources. And I'd like to open up the conversation if there's anybody here who is on the SONIC, the Statement of Need Interim Committee, that wants to add any commentary or input on this Statement of Need. There is another slide in this deck that talks about the objectives that the SONIC feels should be solved for. But let me open it up to folks who are on that committee in case you wanted to add anything about this statement of required resources. Austin, I think maybe you had a part in this, perhaps Athena. I don't know if K-Bob from Targa is here. Karen Bueller, I don't see you on the line yet.
Yes, this is Austin Rushoff. We did help with this a little bit, but I don't have anything to add at this point.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Austin.
you.
Thanks for being part of that. So Deb, I'm going to have you skip forward 2 slides. We'll come back to this one. Let me just put up again, I've referred to the Statement of Need document that Deborah has put in the chat. This is a reminder of some of the other key elements in that document. It had a list of these 9 or 10 objectives that the Statement of Need stakeholders felt we were trying to solve for. So I just put this up as a reminder. It was another very important discussion and input from the Statement of Need Interim Committee. So lots of different needs and interests there that were articulated in the Statement of Need Interim Committee elements. Just wanted to remind you of that before we went back to the previous slide. Deborah, this is where we really want to open it up for conversation amongst everybody here on the phone today. The questions are from that range of resources that Ben just described today and described in detail in late August, with those ranges of variable renewable generation and dispatchable resources required. The question for you all is, do you agree with the characterization of both the size and the characteristics of this analysis? If so, we'd like to hear from you. And if not, we specifically would like to hear from you. And I think let me pause. Athena, I think you had your hand up. Sorry, before I change the slide. Please go ahead, Athena, and then we'll go to Michael. And I know we've got some comments from PRC staff. as mentioned earlier or sent to us earlier today, but I'd like them to be able to describe that. But first, Athena, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Sorry. I am in it depends on what they consider the dispatchable resources. If this is for new, then it cannot be new fossil fueled resources. This is something that is just evident and obvious from what's happening in the nation and the world with climate change. It also doesn't go and jibe with the proposed new clean reduction in greenhouse gases that the president is proposing and we desperately need. And I'll just say, just a full-on, as an energy and environmental engineer, I am on full rebellion for human extinction.
Thanks, Athena. So let me see if I understand. Your first question was really what is included as a dispatchable resource? Is that?
Yes, that would be.
Asking?
That is what I'm asking. I'm guessing from previous that it's talking about new gas, and so that's what my statement afterwards addresses.
So let me ask, Ben, if you might come off mute and describe what is considered in that 1,043 to 4,290 megawatts of dispatchable resources, please.
Yes, so in that range are the scenarios that we modeled. So on the upper end of that range would be no new gas at all. So it would just be lithium-ion batteries. And then on the lower end of that range, we had the two different scenarios. The one scenario where we only allowed long duration energy storage. And then the other scenario where we allowed new gas generation that would be blended to hydrogen and then fully convert to hydrogen within the Energy Transition Act 2045 requirement.
So Athena, to answer your question, it includes a variety of different scenarios. And I think we're hearing you clearly say that your input on this is that the dispatchable resource not include any fossil generation would be your preferred position. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted, I guess, to ask if there was a way to separate out any variability in demand side resources that are included in this. So to what extent energy efficiency or demand response varied across the different scenarios. And then I think, I guess, to Athena's point prior, if that dispatchable resource category could be a bit more granular, so you can see the range of just battery or kind of peaking plants or fossil generation.
Great. So Michael, let's talk about the demand side resources piece first. As you and others have seen, that was a characteristic or a type of resource that the interim committee, the stakeholder group, did identify and I wish to be called out. So let's ask Zoe and Ben, what are your thoughts about adding a bullet, a component in the statement of need that specifically speaks to demand side resources?
Zoe, do you want me to take that one?
Yep, go ahead. I'll add. If we need to, I can speak up as well.
Yeah, so again, just to confirm, we did model the demand response scenario, the time of use rates of the dynamic load shifting, I think we called it. And then there was one other DSM or demand side scenario that we modeled. So those ranges would apply even to those scenarios. So this kind of range was more on the supply side resources. And then I think we have some other recommendations maybe outside of the statement and need that more follow into the action plan. that may be more suited to Michael's comments there. So Margie, up to you, but I wouldn't mind if we could just put maybe a pin in that conversation for now and get to the action plan, see if we address Michael's comments there. And then maybe just to kind of get into the dispatchable resources, kind of that overall statement. Obviously, we have all of the modeling results that do break out the kind of the different number of megawatts per resource type. I have no objections if we want to be a little bit more granular on and just kind of give some examples, but I would just continuously reiterate what we've said throughout this process is we may show it is, and I'm making these numbers up, please don't quote me on these numbers, but we may show it is 1,000 megawatts of hydrogen fired CTs and 600 megawatts of batteries. But when we come to issue the RFP, obviously the real world pricing could change that mix. So happy to provide more details just to give some additional granularity. Subject to the RFP is the only bit I may be out there.
Good, thanks, Ben. And Michael, yes, we will come back to this demand side resources question has been pointed out. It will be mentioned as we talk about action plan. But what I'm hearing, you indicate, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but are you asking that there be a specific call out on the supply side that assumes a certain amount of demand resources in the statement of need, demand side resources in the statement of need? Is that what you'd like to see?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, if the statement of need is showing, across these different scenarios, what are the range of megawatts needed from different resources? If, demand side resources were modeled that same way, then I think they should see the same treatment in the statement of need that here's the, from, 100 megawatts up to 500 megawatts or whatever it is, like that's where we saw demand side resources filling in, because I know they're within each scenario. So there may not be the same range for the other resources, but since they were, as I understood, considered on par.
Great, okay. Great. I know that the folks from the Public Regulation Commission have some thoughts about these ranges. Cynthia, Ed, and Agatha, would you like to come off mute and describe your position regarding these ranges?
Sure. I guess when we're looking at agreement on the analysis, we like the analysis and where it's been going. It's just agreeing to this huge ranges within this time frame is very difficult, and we're really not clear exactly what we're being asked to sign off here. We understand how the numbers were derived and so forth, but it seems difficult for us to say, okay, let's sign off on the full 10,000 megawatts that are required. And I guess it gets back to getting more of the granularity. And are we really looking at the midpoint analysis, that load forecast? And yeah, so we just don't want to say yes and then not really be sure of what sort of RFP could come out of this. So.
Great, thanks, Ed. So let me clarify. I think we have a memo from you all this morning that indicates that you do not support an RFP for a period that includes the high forecast electrification numbers. So things that are on the high end of this, you have questions about and can't support it. I'm assuming from reading your memo that is driven by your concern about affordability for ratepayers. So, but I don't want to don't want to, I'd like to clarify with you, Ed, you just mentioned that you're not sure where you stand on this, and yet we have this document that says you don't support the high end of the range. So I guess I'd like to get
Well,
clarity here.
Sure. That was an example, like the high end of the range, we really don't have the documentation and the analysis done to say, yes, we have to build at 10,000 megawatts.
Okay.
So that's an example of an issue that would be difficult for us to get behind unless we had more analysis and more documentation behind it. Just to agree to it right now, that would be 10,000 megawatts, which would have and as you already noted, a huge impact on the rates. And another issue, since you mentioned it, on rates, there's a non-industrial load that we have to look at as well. And if we brought, you know, the 10,000 megawatts or some other number, if it was all constructed, it would have a pretty impactful consequence for the ratepayers, and that's what we have to look at. We have to be concerned with. And I think in our note to you, you know, we talked about ways of dealing with that and the potential for rate shock. And you know, one of the things we threw out was perhaps looking for the load that would be served for oil and gas services, maybe perhaps through a special services contracts where you would actually carve out that load from the rate base, and the PRC would just take a look at it and approve separate development projects if they made sense. So those are the kind of concerns. So this document just seems to be too all-encompassing in terms of saying you agree with it or not.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I really appreciate your providing more explanation of that. Thank you for speaking up. We had a question in the chat from Austin about this memo from staff. I guess I need to ask PRC staff, do we have permission to share that document with the other stakeholders?
Good.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Austin, we will do that after this meeting, but we will get that to you.
Thank you. Look forward to looking at that.
Okay. Other comments. I mean, many of you have been patient and consistent in attending the various briefings that we've had by the SPS team, and so many of you have a lot of context and background on how this analysis was conducted. Many of you may be seeing this as a snapshot, and don't have the full insight about how the numbers were derived. So we don't have the luxury of creating that knowledge again for you, but we would like to hear from anyone else who's got reactions or thoughts about this statement of need summary that you've seen Beth present here, and any other thoughts about this. Also like to turn this over to my colleague Jay. Is there anything you would like to add to this, or various questions that you might have? The group questions, the discussion is open for anyone who wants to further explore this statement of need.
Unless there's other questions, I just maybe have a couple of comments, and part of this, I think, just to put this back in context, right, this was based on, you know, the range of different scenarios, or the results here are based on the different scenarios that SPS ran with feedback from stakeholders. And to me, I view this as setting the boundaries on the next steps of the process here. And what I mean by that, and I think we'll talk about, you know, some of the proposed action steps that SPS has coming up, but you know, they're looking at this as developing a possible range for an RFP, all source RFP, that process itself will have a number of different checks in the scoping and development and running the RFP. Anything that would be selected out of that would then be further analyzed and submitted to the PRC for approval. So I guess I put this in context as this is to help guide a range of what SPS goes out and asks for. But it's not the only step in itself. And I think we've been trying to solicit feedback on other action items that people should take into consideration in addition to this. So I think we've certainly heard a lot of feedback on additional demand side options. And I think as we tee up the next set part of the discussion on the action plan, we can talk further about that. So I was while this asks for agreement check, I think this is part of the way the rule is written, trying to find where there's consensus. I don't think this is asking you to sign on and, give your approval to this basis for any subsequent decisions or things that come before the commission in particular. So I think that I'm just trying to put it, in a broader context here versus just saying, without some boundary on things, the process has to have some basis here. So I offer that hopefully, so we can find some satisfactory summary here and then move on to the next steps. Is that helpful, Margie?
Yeah, thanks, Jay, for that reminder. And so just to be clear on what happens with this information, as Jay described, noting where there may or may not be disagreement is important as SPS prepares their written IRP. They are asked in this process to identify places where there's resolution or not resolution and comment on those pieces. So this is important as it sets the framework for what actions need to take place in the next 3 years to support the plan that's being developed by SPS. I'd like to call on a few folks who are here and have been very consistent members of our stakeholder group to ask for their views about the statement of need resource analysis. So if you don't have comment, that's okay, but I know there are several of you who've been very, very active and engaged and are quite knowledgeable. So let me ask Chris Leger, Jeffrey Pollock, John Daly. We already heard from Michael Kenny, which we appreciate. And any others who have thoughts about this. Anything from you, Chris or Jeff? John, any thoughts?
This is
Thank you,
Jeff.
Margie.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry about that, Jeff. Yeah, this is Chris Leger. No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think we remain concerned about the level of dispatchable resources as discussed before by other parties. I think, what those resources entail is important to us. But as Jay said earlier, as bookends, I think that this seems like it cracks with my understanding of how the process has gone thus far. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
And this is Jeff. I couldn't say it any better than Chris just did. So, amen.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey. So do you have the same request about the better definition of the level of the types of dispatchable resources? Do you agree with that?
I think it's important to have them and know what they are and know that they're real because the system can't operate without them. But other than that, I think the bookends look pretty good.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Another comment in the chat here, Margie.
Yeah, great. John is traveling and he can't weigh in verbally. We believe that the bookends look reasonable, and John is with NextEra Energy. So just to share that with the group. Thank you, John, for sharing that with us. Other comments from folks about this? Okay, well, let's move to the next piece of this conversation. I've heard a few things. If you can go to the next slide, please, Deb. At this point, I'd like to ask our colleagues from SPS, on the next slide, Deb. Please, thank you. I'd like to ask Zoe, Brooke, Ben, please, share with the group at this point, now that you've heard this feedback on specifically the statement of need, can you share with the group your process, your next steps that you will be taking in consideration of this stakeholder input to the statement of need in the IRP? Of course, we'll talk some more about action plan, and I think this conversation about demand resources will come back. But so would you and your team like to share with the group how you will be considering this information in the next steps as you put together your IRP?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. We'll continue to evaluate the input we received on the statement of need in terms of what we've modeled and what we're already showing in the IRP so that we can point that out. And then if there wasn't anything that specifically was addressed in the modeling yet, we'll continue to assess that and evaluate how to address it as we draft the IRP.
Thanks, Zoe. Anything else your team wanted to add?
Hey, Margie, this is Brooke. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Brooke.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I ditto all the comments from the team there and Zoe. I would just add, for us, the comments we've received this process and the engagement, I think reiterates the value of consideration of a range, right? The pinpointing an exact megawatt need is a challenge when we're looking forward and we're looking for an RFP to bring in resources, actual resources with actual pricing that'll fill a portfolio for this process. So really appreciate the stakeholder engagement and feedback that's helped us shape this range and the considerations that have gone into it. I think evaluating a range in the formation of the creation of RFP documents, Ben, will help provide a range of guidance to bidders who want to participate in this RFP and propose projects and be considered. And from a resource planning perspective, whether it was SPS or a different utility, having that range of megawatt needs creates flexibility in the optimization of the most economical and reliable portfolio or portfolios that we would propose as a result of, again, getting actual resource bids, right? So we're going to have more options here as a group, as a jurisdiction, to look at the portfolios that can be constructed to meet our needs at different levels of load, can optimize those in the future with this kind of range flexibility to ensure a reliable system is produced by any portfolio that's evaluated. And then kind of to staff's comments, be able to look at what I'll call informally, maybe shoulder projects on a portfolio, right? And be able to incrementally add or remove shoulder projects around a portfolio because we have the range and the guidance and the flexibility that provides us in portfolio evaluation. So I just think the creative thoughts in the stakeholder group has given SPS quite a bit of opportunity to really ensure that the final portfolio it's selected is the most economical and reliable solution for our needs in 28 through 30. So thank you all. We all have the same goal, right, of getting to that place when we have actual resource bids later next year and into 2026 when we're making project decisions. And those kind of frameworks are really going to enable, I think, greater success through this process.
Thanks, Brooke. I appreciate that additional set of information. So before we shift to the action plan, I'm going to try to summarize the main comments that we've heard about the statement of need from the stakeholder group. We heard, one, the desire for additional definition of the dispatchable resources that are part of the statement of need, with at least one stakeholder specifically against that, including any new fossil-based generation. We have an input from a stakeholder asking that more clarity be included in the statement of need regarding the demand side resources contribution to the portfolio going forward. We have some concern about the high end of the resource requirement in the range that was provided. And then finally, well, Chris, the other was the level of dispatchable resources. So again, having more color or clarification on what is included as part of that dispatchable resource based was of your interest. So those were the items that I heard that were sort of deltas or changes or improvements to the statement of need material. Or in one case, just noting that the concern from PRC staff about the high end of that range. So I think we've accomplished what we had set out, to hear your feedback, to hear where you would like either more clarification or don't agree with something in there. And that was extremely helpful. And we appreciate your insights on, especially those of you who've been through the many briefings and discussions that know some of the detail behind all this fabulous analysis. So thank you for that. And Jay or Deb, is there anything on this topic that we need to continue to describe before we shift to the action plan?
Nothing from me, thanks.
Okay. Deborah, anything from you that we need to do on this part?
No, thank you, Margie.
How about to you, Zoe and Ben and Brooke? Is there anything you would like clarification on with respect to this statement of need conversation?
Nothing from me, Margie. Thank you.
No, Margie, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the work. So let's shift now. We had planned to take a short break, but we are a little ahead of schedule. I think we will take, since we've been going for 50 minutes, let's take just a short 10-minute break. Deb, could you put the next slide up just to let people know where we're going next? We're going to talk about the action plan. So let's give you all a chance to move, get a drink of water, or whatever is necessary. Let's take a short break till 2 o'clock. It's now 1:49 Mountain Daylight Time. We'll resume in 11 minutes with the conversation about the action plan. So thank you. Please take a short break. Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for tolerating a little shift in schedule. Thought it was good to take a break when we shift topics, so we got a chance to take a quick break. The final step in the process of the facilitated stakeholder process is to discuss items for the action plan. And so that's what we're going to do next in the remaining part of this meeting. As a refresher for all of you, the IRP rule describes the action plan, and it says the utilities action plan shall, 1, detail the specific actions the utility shall take to implement the IRP, spanning a 3-year period following the filing of the utilities IRP. So that's 2024, 25, 26. And as you all have heard, SPS is also getting started on the planning beyond that because of the lead time required to get new resources online. Number 2, the utility action plan shall also detail specific actions the utility shall take to develop any resource solicitations or contracting activities to fulfill the statement of need as accepted by the Commission. And 3, the plan shall include a status report on specific actions contained in the previous action plan. So we're going to focus on items 1 and 2 here and get your thoughts for those of you who have not yet put in suggestions to the action plan. This will be your opportunity to submit ideas. And what we're going to do is we're going to first review the contributions from stakeholders that have been turned in related to action plan suggestions. Then we will hear from the SPS team on action plan ideas that they are considering. And then we will have an exercise to try to map these suggestions and find out where there is overlap or common interest from both the stakeholders and SPS to put items on the list that both organizations or both parties support. So I'll ask again that you be prepared to have a discussion about things that have been suggested by both the utilities and stakeholders. And if you get inspired from this conversation and want to add an action plan item into the chat, we'll ask you to put it in the chat, and then we'll also ask you to come off mute and describe your suggestion so that we can capture it accurately and begin to map it to find where there are common elements. So that's our plan for this next step. First, hear a summary of the stakeholder input on action plan, then hear from the utility on things they're considering as possible parts of the action plan. Get input from all of you if you've not yet provided it or if you have new inspiration. And then we'll take a break and try to then come back and map the suggestions for the action plan into areas where there's common interest or areas where there's a stakeholder interest, areas where there's a utility interest. So are there any questions about our process, next process, or Jay, is there any clarification you would like to offer as we jump into this next piece?
No, thanks. You covered it well.
Okay. All right. So the next slide is a compilation of the suggestions that have been received to date from stakeholders. And I'll read those here so that give you a chance also to contemplate, reflect on those. The first item was from the Statement of Need Interim Committee, and it was an action to engage customers to help the utility reliably serve all during grid-constrained events, including new rate structures. The second one we received by email, and it said, and this I should have it in quotes because this is the quote right out of the email. The end result of any plan or recommended action should ensure reliability, affordability, and resiliency. If affordability and dispatchability is not serious, consider you haven't done your job. I think maybe this author meant if affordability and dispatchability is not seriously considered, you haven't done your job. But that's so an interest in the reliability, affordability, resiliency piece. The third suggestion, I want to see SPS addressed in their action plan, how they will ensure system reliability and resiliency, affordability to consumers, and a continued investment in our local communities. The fourth entry, this organization suggests that Excel prioritize they will ensure system reliability and resiliency, as well as continued expansion of and investment in the electrical grid serving Eddy County. Our county's industrial base continues to expand, and the infrastructure for the needs of this growth must be proactive to ensure its sustainability. And then 2 other actions that were submitted was 1, an analysis and or study of how to reduce oil and gas connected load through voluntary programs. And the last one was an analysis and or a study of interruptible tariffs for high tech and other loads. So these were the pieces that were suggested by stakeholders. I think before we go to hearing from SPS on, now let's do that. Let's now go to SPS and have Zoe, maybe you can talk through what are the action plan ideas that your team has been discussing, and then we'll open it up for conversation of people who want to add color to any of the action items that were discussed or offer new ones. So that's what we received to date. Thank you all for your input. And let's now shift to the next slide, if we could, please, Deborah, and have Zoe share with the group what are the items for the action plan that you all have been discussing.
Thanks, Margie. So I'll start off by saying this is a list that's very much in development as we as an organization, along with the stakeholders here, digest the modeling results and draft the IRP. Obviously, there's actions that we will take no matter what. So those are listed here in the next 3 years. The development of an all-source RFP for our closest resource need at the end of the decade makes the list. We'll need to engage an independent evaluator per the PRC rules, and develop those RFP bid evaluation documents, including reliability assessments and fuel security assessment documents for evaluating those bids. We'll have to select a portfolio of resources coming out of that RFP and then file CCN and PPA approval for those. Now, we know we need to do these actions, and we know that these actions will take up most of the 3-year action plan period, just completing these. So other things that we are considering for the action plan list to address the 20-year planning horizon. And I think staff, I think Cynthia Mitchell with staff had brought this idea up at a past meeting, but developing an RFI for long lead emerging technology resources ahead of the next IRP cycle is something that we're considering. We're going to be evaluating demand response options, including an ICO tariff, and we'll be requesting regulatory approval where appropriate. Also, in response to the last slide, we do have a voluntary program for large industrial customers that is currently in front of the commission. I think it's something we'll consider to put on the action plan that's in response to that item on the last slide would be to evaluate how that program grows and whether we should grow that program. And I think we'll have some really good information following regulatory approval and once we see what subscriptions are like in that program. So again, this is an ongoing effort for SPS. We're evaluating a lot of options and developing this list as we draft the IRP and digest those modeling results that we all are digesting together. And my colleague Brooke Trammell has her hand up, so I'll hand it over to her.
Thanks, Zoe. I would just add, we will also be evaluating the feasibility and applicability of extending existing generation unit lives. So Margie, that didn't make the list, it looks like on the slide, but that's absolutely something that will be applicable to the action plan timeframe and would be a part of the IRP considerations.
So Brooke, can you restate that? It'd be evaluating existing.
Generation unit life extensions.
Okay. Thank you.
Margie, this is Cynthia for staff. So Brooke, thank you for that. So that will be added into what as one of the action items.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And that's gonna be,
Cynthia,
that will be the expiring gas and renewable PPAs in your own fleet, right, of gas generation.
That's what I was headed to. So we can evaluate extension of generation lives for units that we own. We can encourage, or in the bid documents, the RFP documents, I'm sorry, have instructions and considerations for repowers or PPA extensions, those kind of things. But you can appreciate we don't have as much control on those decisions under the PPA structure, right? But certainly for our company-owned units, that will be an evaluation we will conduct. We'll be somewhat limited to the PPA extensions as submitted in response to the RFP.
Okay, and I'm somewhat ignorant on this. So the PPA extensions, I know it's on the project owner to take the initiative to bid into your solicitation again, and some of them will be repowering and some of them will be adding storage and all of this. I would just think that there's a certain competitive edge that they have because they are an existing resource with an existing site and such, and that given the immediacy of the resource need, those would in some way or the other come to the top for at least consideration, and if their price points and other contract requirements are too onerous, of course you don't take them. But
I agree.
That's one thing that we've been talking about internally, and I know you consider those essentially new resources, don't you?
They would show up as largely new bids, repowered bids or extended bids. And there'd be, to your point, some potential negotiation there to finalize any agreements or extensions, but that's absolutely something that'll be considered. And to your point, the bid evaluation criteria will be established, right, for the whole RFP process. And some of those existing projects may have a leg up on other projects in the bid evaluation criteria, or they may not, right? Depending on their structure and pricing and other things.
So I don't want to beat the horse on this, but just to be clear for staff, we're really looking forward to seeing language that specifies there's a tremendous resource need on the system, and the utility as first order priorities will be looking towards extensions of existing and continuation or new PPAs with existing PPAs, recognizing that should help spread out some of the rate impact over time.
I think we don't want to lose sight of life extensions probably can't be very long for some units, right? We may have, I'll call them incremental extensions of a few years or a couple years, depending on the status and the asset health of the unit.
Right.
But that can be something that can bridge us, say, to the next IRP or something like that, and flatten, to your point, some of those end of decade cost impacts if we're smoothing the generation addition timing. That's going to smooth the rate impact as well.
Right, and that's, back to our memo that most people haven't seen, that's really what we're after and what our concern is here, that we don't just give the impression at this point that an RFP for 10,000 megawatts by 2030 is okay with us, given the potential rate impact of that, and that our understanding, having worked with you up to this point, is that you will be looking to do everything possible to extend units and then get new PPAs. And I know, your existing gas fleet's pretty old, most of it, but any additional few years you can get on that is likely to be helpful. And part of our discussion we had the other day about the potential heavy lift with long duration storage. If long duration storage can't come through as a dispatchable resource in the amount and time that you forecast, then it's gonna be punted over potentially to new gas. So if that's gonna be the default, then let's go with the existing gas for another few years.
So I'm going to try to shape this conversation in the form of action plan ideas. And what I've captured from this is it sounds like between at least the stakeholder represented by the PRC staff and SPS, the idea that there's common interest in evaluating existing generation life extensions for SPS owned units. That sounds like that's a common, that both are interested in this. I'm hearing the encouragement by PRC staff stakeholder about exploring PPE extensions as well. And I think that I heard Brooke say that that's something that can be looked at, but SPS does not have control over those resources. So I'm not sure that that is a common action item. I've listed it under the stakeholder side as explore PPA extensions. So Zoe and Brooke, you need to help calibrate me if I'm hearing the conversation correctly or not.
I think that's fair, Margie. We can explore, but for a PPA extension, there's two counterparties involved, right? And so that's where our position is we don't have direct control of our ability to do that, given that there need to be agreement with another counterparty, and also understanding that counterparties may or may not want to bid extensions or repowers into the RFP. But we're very aligned with staff's comments here, and especially in the near term economics that may be present with a life extension. There will be costs associated with a life extension.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're not free, even on a company-owned unit. And we do need, as an operator in a utility, load responsible entity, we do need to begin to invest differently, potentially, in our generation resources if we're planning for a unit extension. We can't wait till, say, the year that it was going to retire to start maintaining or investing in a unit to then extend it, say, 5 years, right? We need to be building in expectations for different investment in facilities to make sure they can be extended. So those are implications, Cynthia, that take shape in other regulatory forums, right? In terms of reviewing investment in existing facilities and rate proceedings or CCNs, other items. But those are going to have a much different cost impact than a new resource, right? So we're very aligned with staff on the economic value of evaluating life extensions.
Great, thank you. I see, Athena, you've added a comment. I'm going to come to that in a moment. I'd like to reopen the conversation about demand response. Michael Kenny had expressed the input about being more clear on the demand response part of the resources in the statement of need. And I see we've got a action here on evaluated demand response options. And I'd like to open it up to Michael Kenny to say, Michael, do you have a suggested action that you would like to see in the action plan around demand response as a resource?
Thanks, Margie. I think some more detailed language, if in reference to especially the scenario where demand response was modeled as kind of no cost to see what it would displace and what the overall portfolio cost difference was to kind of ballpark a value of that demand response. I think if there's an action item connected to that scenario, where in which SPS is exploring how it could go about procuring demand response at that value and at that given megawatt, to the extent that it's hard to say since we don't know what the final RFP will look like, uh, but yeah, I think that something to that degree would be useful. And I guess separately on the load management side, so tied to the kind of time of use change, if to whatever extent, SPS can pursue those time varying rates. And I think that could be tied into their pending grid modernization case, which I think assuming that that case is resolved and SPS can move forward deploying smart meters, then there's an opportunity during the next 3 years, as those meters are, I think it's the next, it'd be over a 3-year period that those meters would get deployed, for SPS to be exploring different time varying rates that could have an impact down the road and into future IRPs.
Okay, so Michael, the first suggestion, let me make sure I've got this clear, that based on the modeled scenario and demand response, you're suggesting that an action be determine the value of those resources, and then what action after that? I guess I'm unclear as to how you'd like to pose the actual action plan item.
Yeah, I guess I guess the action item would be to have a kind of stakeholder engagement process around, they're going to show maybe a value, a megawatt value. So that, can we have a discussion about with stakeholders, what do we think SPS should do to actually procure that value of demand response? What kind of program designs could be useful, or what kind of RFP could be crafted to go after that amount of demand response? So maybe that's the actionable item.
Great. Okay. All right. And you'll see this once we get to the mapping, that I'm trying to capture your words. Michael, that's super helpful. Thank you. But I assume, so back to you though, Michael, from your conversation, and Ben, you had responded that you thought there might be a demand response, action here that addressed Michael's interest. I am still hearing Michael and perhaps other stakeholders be interested in having a clear statement in the statement of need that addresses the amount. Maybe it's not the amount of demand side resources that would be part of that, but maybe it's a placeholder that does exactly what Michael says: determine the value and then initiate a stakeholder process to design an appropriate demand response program. So maybe it belongs here rather than in the statement of need, but let me ask you, Michael, how do you feel about that?
I guess I was viewing them slightly differently.
Okay.
Across all the scenarios that SPS did, there's, an amount of energy efficiency or an amount of demand response that was part of that. And so I think just having that called out as a part of the statement of need, that part of this whole resource stack in a given year, here's the amount of megawatts that SPS is expecting from efficiency or demand response. Separately, the action item, in the action plan is, okay, how do we go after these resources?
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Michael. That's super helpful. Athena, over to you. We're at a point where definitely we want other input and ideas about action plan items. So I see you've got something in the chat. Athena, would you like to come off mute and articulate your item?
Okay, have to reread it.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that the action plan is not only considering affordability, reliability, but also the future viability. And I think Cynthia touched on it a little bit with the extension of gas plants. There needs to be a consideration of the cradle to end of life. So from extraction to the end of a system's life on the greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm just putting in that pushes us to say no more new fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot count on, I think it's carbon capture and sequestration. So I think I did that one right. And we need to be retiring gas early. Fugitive methane emissions, as an environmental engineer, I'm reminding people that it really needs to be assessed more like 120 times with more warming potential than CO2. So those fugitive methane emissions are very concerning right now. And in the next 5 to 10 years.
So Athena, yeah, let me push on you and ask, what would be a specific action item with a timetable on this? Is it a study? Is it a analysis? Is it what would you like to be done that's sort of specific and measurable and everybody knows that it's been done, it's done?
I think as you're doing the looking at the different scenarios with gas, that a study needs to be made to include the fugitive methanes in the calculations of greenhouse gas emissions. So while the ETA talks about the emissions after the gas has been extracted and burnt, it needs to be starting to evaluate the emissions of fugitive methane during the whole process. It's been very, very underrepresented and counted.
And I'm gonna push just a little more. Include fugitive methane emissions in analysis, in RFP bid evaluations. Where specifically do you want this consideration?
It should be the analysis. It should be in the analysis, the modeling, the analysis.
For the next IRP?
Actually, I guess it should be included in the RFP process. Let's be real, if they're putting new gas, it needs to be considered.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for pushing on this, but I'm trying to make sure that our actions that are suggested are tangible and can be considered. So thanks for allowing me to quiz you and help articulate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Brooke.
Thanks, Margie. I just want to know if I could ask a question there, clarifying question, Athena.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure, absolutely.
Are you referring to consideration or evaluation of emissions beyond SPS's system? In other words, suggesting emissions beyond our electrical infrastructure is subject to the emissions or the clean energy requirements of the ETA?
Yes, I am. It's called true accounting. And I know it's something that needs to be done all over the place.
Brooke, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Don't worry, I also requested P&M to do something similar.
Great, and just and so a reminder for folks, we're collecting input. It is the utility's prerogative to comment on any actions that they decide not to include in their action plan, and that will be commented on when they submit the IRP. But what we're trying to do today is to identify those topics and actions that that everyone in the meeting, both stakeholders and the utility, agree are a good idea. So we're capturing them on both lists, the SPS considered action plan items and those requested by stakeholders. And our last process later today will be to look to see where there's common ground. What other action items are there that people would like to add to the list? Either those that you've been inspired by from this conversation, from any party, whether it be the utility or a stakeholder, other ideas for action plan items. James Hall, are you still on, or did he have to leave? Let's see, James. Wonder if James had any input on this. Okay, no, he's gone. Any other ideas for action plan items? Again, this is your opportunity before the IRP gets filed to make your voice known and your ideas considered. So please speak up if there's something that's been missed or that you've been inspired by. Gav, you see a hand up? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to push for there to also be a action item related to energy efficiency, so separate from demand response or kind of time varying rates. And I think this is kind of, relates to SPS's ongoing stakeholder process that they do for their triennial energy efficiency plans. But I think just comparing what are the levels of efficiency they're seeing coming out through these scenarios, and how does that compare to what they're procuring through those 3-year plans. And so it's probably bringing in this IRP discussion to those stakeholder groups where we review what SPS can do, in those 3-year cycles.
So that's Michael, so compare energy efficiency procurements through the established 3-year EE plan review process. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess just more simply, for those 3-year energy efficiency plans, making sure that we're considering what SPS modeled in the IRP and how do they compare? Is SPS able to, say, show 60 megawatts of savings or 60 megawatt hours of savings from residential in their plans, whereas in the IRP process we're seeing 100. So just trying to understand if there are differences, where are they, and what can we do to align the two a little better.
All right, good. So you're kind of informing that future, the program and future analysis by looking what's really happening in the energy efficiency offerings compared to what's been modeled.
Yeah.
Okay, I've not been very elegant in articulating that, but I think that's the idea, right? Okay. Ed and Cynthia and Agatha, did you have another suggestion? I see you've come off mute. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Ed. I was just going to say that we talked about voluntary programs earlier, and that was included. But I also wanted to include special service contracts, which can be used for things like data servers, and that's another way to meet load without the potential for increasing rates to the other ratepayers. So it would be another thing that we'd like to study and take a look at.
So that's special service contracts.
Right. And in that situation, the PRC would review a PPA and the project plan. And as long as the project, they'd approve it as long as the project didn't have any incremental or cross-subsidization issues with the ratepayer. So it's kind of like another way of, basically would carve out the project from the rate base and reduce that rate effect.
So, and Margie, if you look at our email yesterday at noon, we referred to voluntary programs for oil and gas. And then in the memo we sent you yesterday, a little bit after 5, we refined that language on oil and gas to include special service contracts. And so we're actually interested in both of those elements, voluntary programs and special service contracts, and possibly anything else in regard to oil and gas that would in some way meet their electrification needs, but not impact the rest of the customer base.
Okay, great. Thanks. I've made that a clarification. And you're specifically orienting this action towards oil and gas and not other large industrial customers. Is that correct?
That's right. We're concerned with the significant jump in potential load requirements, and then the near-term RFP requirements just in this 28-30 period from the electrification load. And that electrification load is the oil and gas, as we understand it. That when we use the term electrification, we're talking about oil and gas load.
Okay, thank you.
And then just while the mic is open here, we do also have our other item, which is the analysis and study of interoperable tariffs for the high tech and other loads, data server, data service loads.
Deb, can you go back one slide, please?
So yeah, that's
got that.
that's what you've got there. Yeah,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. And I've modified the language in our notes about the prior item to include voluntary programs and special service contracts.
Perfect.
And you'll see they're here shortly when we do our comparison. Let me ask Zoe and Ben and Brooke to comment on this theme that we're hearing from these first 4 suggestions from stakeholders. We're really rallying around, actually, I guess the 3 in the center: reliability, affordability, and resiliency. Obviously, those are key tenets to your analysis and your operation of the system. But I'm having a hard time taking these bullets and converting them to an action plan item. I imagine you all have some thoughts about this. Do you want to just share your thoughts about looking at reliability, affordability, and resiliency in a more specific, transparent way for stakeholders?
Thanks, Margie. I don't have any specific action plan suggestions today stemming from these general comments, but I do agree that these are also important priorities for SPS. And so we'll be taking into consideration this input as we're developing the action plan as well, and recognizing that even though they're not specific actions that they provided, that they can help shape specific actions that we can point to are responsive to that feedback. So I think that's how we'll have to go forward in processing that feedback, recognizing we share those priorities, and developing some action plan items that we believe are responsive, and identifying that we believe those are responsive in the IRP.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zoe. I'm going to put this topic as one that in the Venn diagram I think is common. I mean, it's an interest of utility, it's of interest of the stakeholders, even though the actions are TBD. I'll capture it as a theme that I think there's a genuine interest by all parties on this.
Yeah, agreed. And you'll see in our list that we provided already, you know, we're already saying that we need to develop a reliability assessment for evaluating bids in the RFP. I think that's responsive to these comments. So that's just one example of something that the utility can identify here.
And how about the affordability piece? What kind of analysis?
Again, Margie, I'm not prepared to like say specific actions that we can take, but I think we should be responsive to that. And I also think when you think about the IRP and the and some of what we've already talked about with staff in today in terms of assessing whether we can extend lives, things like that, I think are all responsive to the affordability piece of it. So do I have any new ideas today that we haven't discussed? I'm not prepared to share those, but I definitely think that this is a shared priority for us and that we're looking at it. If I'm forgetting anything that we've already discussed, I invite Ben or Brooke to chime in, but I think there's definite overlap here from what we've already discussed today with staff as well.
Yeah, Zoe, the only thing I may add is we keep calling it a reliability analysis. I think that's how we refer to it on the next slide, Margie. Really what we're talking about there is a reliability and resiliency analysis. So every portfolio that we model is going to be resource adequate in terms of meeting our plan and reserve margin requirements. and then energy adequate in terms of meeting our projected energy over the lifetime of the model. When we talk about a reliability analysis, we're really talking reliability and resiliency, because what we're going to do is we're going to stress test, for example, and this, it's not definitive list, but we're stress test a weather year. So what happens if the weather was to do X, Y, or Z? So really it's a reliability and resiliency analysis. So just wanted to make sure we were addressing those 2 points in that one action item.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks.
Ben.
Go ahead, Zoe.
Oh, I just said thanks, Ben.
So Deb, can you go to the next slide so we can remind people where Ben is adding the resiliency piece? That's the third bullet up there, Ben, is that correct?
That's correct. And fuel security is like another example of resiliency. Right. So when you do a reliability analysis, you tend to assume you have fuel security for the course of the year. So when you start looking at reliability analyses, resiliency analyses, you can start stress testing those assumptions to see how the system would operate under non-optimal conditions.
Okay.
Margie, can we just talk about this? I think I just want to try and connect. I see 3 items on here on the top of SPS's list that fall under the umbrella of, what the goals of the reliability, affordability, resilience. So first, right, the first goal is develop all source RFP. That's been done through modeling analysis through an optimization model that has reliability constraints considered in it. So kind of the work going into developing bullet number 1, kind of that's the first step of the process. The bid evaluation itself as a competitive solicitation, taking all these factors in, including, I think this has come up a little bit, but there are some non-price factors that SPS would be considering, things like location, potential resilience, reliability benefits. And then the last bullet, all this still gets sent to the PRC for review and approval. So there's another full vetting process with opportunities for input there. So I see the processes here, in line with the feedback that stakeholders have given to, support those goals. I guess I'm speaking as someone that overseen this in a different venue, but I see those as aligned. So I know, so I didn't want to speak specifically, but I see kind of process-wise and broadly that that's not everything, but I think what you're trying to do is aligned with those goals.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jay, and certainly the fact that we end this, not this specific IRP process, but what results from the IRP process are subsequent CCN and PPA filings, where we look at the prudence of the portfolio and examine all of this, is certainly the last step in the regulatory process before we build, to confirm that those 3 items have been considered.
So while we're on this list, let me ask if there's any stakeholder that has concern or issue with these top 5 bullets. And they're required by the rule, and you've heard folks talk about how that goes forward, but are there any concerns or questions about those 5 items in the action plan?
Margie, I do have one question, and this goes back to the range of resources that we were discussing earlier. And when you add the dispatch and the variable categories together, that gets us to the over 5,000 to almost 11,000 megawatts. And it's unclear to us whether it's SPS's intention to bid for the full 10,000 in the 28-30 timeframe, or to do an RFP for that amount. Or maybe that decision hasn't been made yet.
Zoe, do you want to field that one?
I'm sorry, Margie, Cynthia, can you ask that question again? Is it SPS's intention to what?
Are you going to do your RFP for the upper end of the determined need, which is about 10,000 when you add the two categories together of variable and dispatchable?
And I'll let Ben chime in as well, but as Brooke stated earlier, that range is what we'll be using for RFP purposes.
So you'll bid, you'll put it in the solicitation of, we have anywhere from X to Y resource need. It could be 5,000 and it could be 10,000.
Yeah, that's right. Ben, am I getting that right?
Yeah, so Cynthia, we can obviously talk about this further. My preference would be for the RFP to include the upper end of that range. Now, that absolutely is not saying we will go out and procure that amount of resources regardless. Obviously, you know, we would have to have further discussions on cost implication. But what we want to do is we want to give signals to the market, essentially, that we have a large resource need, and try and get as many proposals in as possible to get the lowest possible cost for our customers. Obviously, we would then have to go back and make sure, you know, updated load forecasts kind of match with our expectation. There'll be other steps along the way, as Jay was just pointing out, in terms of CCN approvals and other bits and pieces. But we would certainly want to incorporate the upper end of that range to encourage as much market participant as possible. Now, what we don't want to do, though, is obviously say, hey, we're issuing an RFP for 10,000 megawatts and then only just go out and procure, you know, 500 megawatts. That would be the flip side. You don't want to be giving the market too many false signals either. But yeah, I think a range, including the upper range, would be reasonable for the purposes of issuing the RFP and just to get as many proposals as we possibly can.
And
okay, I understand that. I also, maybe just in my simple thinking, if you issue RFP for, say, just a set point around, say, 7,500 megawatts, or whether it's 5,000 or 10,000 or 7,500, at least the two lower numbers or the lowest number, you're likely to get more megawatt bids than that total amount.
Yeah,
I was thinking also back to last week or the week before when you said that SPP has 23,000 megawatts in the pipeline queue now. As part of that power pool, as a member of the power pool, do you draw from that or get to look at any of those bids, or will some of those bidders bid into your RFP as well as stay in the SPP bid? I don't know how that world works.
So Ben, I'll let you answer briefly, and then I'm gonna comment about the specifics of the RFP. So go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the 20,000 megawatts, that is specific to SPS's area within the SPP. I think there's something like 100 gigawatts of generation across the entire footprint in the queue right now. So we expect a very large portion of that 20 gigawatts, whatever's in the queue right now, would be receptive to bidding into an SPS RFP. And that's why, Cynthia, I don't disagree with you. Maybe we could give a set point, plus or minus 1,000, 2,000 megawatts. Maybe we give a range. But what we want to do is send signals to that 20,000 megawatts in the queue in SPS's area that we have a resource need within this time period, and you should potentially propose those resources into our competitive solicitation next year.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And I'll just add that, you know, having as competitive a bid process as possible, I think is in line with Commission's goals in that new IRP rule to increase the competitive format for analyzing resource portfolios and for identifying cost-effective portfolios. So the more competitive our RFP is, I think the more likely it is that we'll be getting those cost-effective portfolios.
Yeah, thanks for that, Zoe. I just want to remind the group that the details of the RFP documents are also part of a future process that are subject to public review as well. So instead of trying to what if the RFP at this point, I'm just trying to get a sense from stakeholders if the items on here and the details will matter as to what the scope, et cetera, is. But I'm trying to get a sense from stakeholders if there's any disagreement about those 5 steps going forward, recognizing that we already had the discussion about the range of resources is a subject to further discussion and probably commission review. But I'm trying to understand if there are people have concerns about these 5 steps going forward. Obviously, the size of the request is a key concern. Are there other concerns? Go ahead, Athena.
Yes, I'm just wishing to add, along with reliability and fuel security in the RFP process assessment, that it front and center include carbon emissions.
Okay, great, thank you.
May I ask a question? What, when you say include carbon emissions, include them how?
I mean, how do you include fuel security and reliability assessments? You know, must be some sort of criteria or grading that you use. There must be something we can do with carbon emissions as well. Give it a point system, you know, in order to evaluate it.
Let me ask James. I see you're on, James Hall from ExxonMobil, and James, we hadn't had a chance to check in with you today. I'd like to give you an opportunity if you have any comments on items in the 2 action plan list, the action plan items suggested by SPS, and the growing list of action items considered as of interest to the stakeholders. Is there anything you wanted to add, James?
Not really. I'm driving, so I'll be brief.
Okay.
I guess, you know, I agree with what's been said, and I understand the cost concern implications. I think everybody understands this is a pretty significant ask for an RFP, whatever it turns out to be. But the reality is, you know, as an oil and gas industry and as our company, we are committed to decarbonising our operations, and the only way to do that is to electrify your operations and have access to carbon neutral electrons. And so however we end up being able to do that is obviously the goal. But I definitely acknowledge the just some of the concerns that have been expressed, and we have to sort of think creatively to move forward. So that's about what I have for the time being.
Great, thank you, James, and thanks for your continued engagement in this process. All right, let's go forward and talk about how we're going to now take this information that has been contributed and added to today and try to map it into a Venn diagram. Deb, could you go forward in slide deck, please, to here? Yes. So our challenge after the break is to start to map these suggestions into these 3 bubbles, looking for things that are common and I think we can do that in some themes. So I'm going to ask if anybody has an action item that they have not yet put in writing. Feel free to put that into the chat. I've tried to capture your ideas. You could tell from my questions, encouraging you all to be specific on what should be done. But if you feel strongly about an action that has not been written down, either through our action plan input survey or email or chat, that you do that over the break so that we are sure to capture everything. And I will confer with my colleagues over the break on the list that I've created. We'll put something in the chat that then you can pull up and look at how we're mapping the ideas, and we'll have a discussion about those things that are common and those things that may fall into one of the two outside bubbles. So are there any other comments or questions from anybody, including Jay? Anything you wanted to add before we go into break?
Nothing for now. I think it's going to come up in the next discussion. So thanks.
Gotcha. Okay. Any other questions from the group? All right, let's take a 13-minute break. It's now 3:02 Mountain Time. We'll reconvene at 3:15 Mountain Time, and we'll see you back for Venn diagram mapping. Welcome back, everyone, to our Venn diagram mapping and compare and contrast of action plan items. Thanks for your input to date. Here's what we're planning to do next. As you can see, we've got these three bubbles that depict the various inputs from SPS and from stakeholders, and our objective is to identify those items that are common, but also to identify those items that are not common and document that as a result of our process. So what we've done over the last conversation and the break is create a document, which I'm now going to share on my screen, that puts words under each of these bubbles to hopefully reflect what we've heard from you all. So let me share my screen. This is work in process and is going to be real-time edited while we talk. So can you see this Word document? Can somebody verify you can see a document that's got the three bubbles and then text boxes below?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is start with, this is not gonna scroll. Yeah. Start with the items on the left, which are the SPS suggested action plan items. And I've listed them here. Some of these things are going to look familiar, like developing the all-source RFP, engaging the independent evaluator, develop the RFP bid evaluation documents. I've added resiliency to this. Athena, you'll note a little bit later on the stakeholder side, we've added carbon to that evaluation criteria. Select the portfolio of resources based on the evaluation, file the CCNPPA approval, and develop the RFI for long lead time, emerging tech resources. And that's one we'd like to talk about first, because we haven't had much discussion about that. You know that emerged as an idea in a previous meeting. And so I'd like to ask Zoe and Ben and Brooke if you have some sense of what that would look like or what you're thinking about, and ask for stakeholder feedback about that so that we can decide whether that goes into the common item box or stays on the utilities side. So Zoe or Brooke or Ben, do you want to describe a little bit about what you're thinking of there?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. This was really in response to Cynthia's suggestion that this might be something we look at on August 29th. And we're evaluating it still internally and deciding whether or not this is something that should go into the action plan. But certainly welcome stakeholder feedback in terms of what, if anything, they would like to see in such an RFI. I think that would be helpful to us in evaluating whether we should include that in an action plan, help that evaluation. But this would also be something specifically to ask for more information about some of those long lead dispatchable resources that may not be commercially available today, but might be in the future that we'll want to start considering, but we don't necessarily have generic pricing on yet because they're still evolving technologies. So I'll let Ben, if Ben has anything to add to that, I welcome it, but this is something that we're considering in response to staff's recommendation in that stakeholder meeting, and certainly welcome more feedback from stakeholders on what they would like to see in a long lead RFI, long lead time resource RFI.
Ben, is there anything you wanted to add to what Zoe mentioned?
No, the only thing I maybe will add there, Margie, is the struggle we've had or the challenges we've had with this IRP is the fact that we've kind of demonstrated that wind, solar in 4-hour batteries is probably not the most economical solution. There needs to be alternative dispatchable generation. And that technology is kind of on the cusp of being commercially available. Maybe it's not quite there, or it's certainly not been there historically. So as we start looking further out into the 2030s, into the 2040s particularly, we're going to want some better pricing signals for emerging technologies, whether that's long duration storage, maybe it's SMRs, I think was brought up in our last meeting. It may be a good idea to get some good pricing, some good technical characteristics of these resources without necessarily trying to conflate an RFP. We're actually looking at procuring resources and next year. So I think it's a good idea. It's definitely something we're considering internally, and just looking forward to hearing anyone's feedback on the potential for an RFI.
So yeah, I would like to take stakeholder feedback on that question. I've heard Ben, now you and Zoe both mentioned in particular dispatchable resources. I imagine that there's some stakeholders on the phone that would like that to say dispatchable carbon-free resources. But let's hear from the stakeholders. How do you feel about this action of soliciting, putting out an RFI for long lead time emerging tech resources before the next IRP cycle begins?
And Margie, maybe if I can just jump in to clarify that point. When we're talking emerging tech for dispatchable, we are talking about carbon-free resources. So just to add that clarification.
Are you okay, Ben, with me adjusting the words to say that?
Sure.
Okay, great. Comment, stakeholders, how do people feel about that?
Thumbs up from us.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. Are there any objections to putting that suggestion into the common items box?
I'll just add that.
Do it.
I'll just add that we still are internally looking at it and haven't made any decisions. But I did want to highlight this as something that we're looking at internally.
Great, thanks, Zoe. Well, it doesn't sound like there's any stakeholder objection to that.
Well, let me ask a question. Does that mean that resources that aren't carbon free but could use some type of carbon removal technology would not be part of this mix, so that the end result would be carbon free, but you'd still have to remove the carbon? Or are we eliminating consideration of those types of resources?
Good question,
Yes.
Jeff.
So Jeff, and I didn't mean my addition of carbon free to get us into maybe a policy debate, but my thought here would be essentially it would conform with the ETA. So we could consider both true carbon free resources. In other words, there's never any carbon produced, for example, SMRs, but we could also evaluate CCS or any other form of carbon capture, assuming it qualifies with the ETA.
And I'm actually okay with that.
I can't put way more modifiers in here than we could probably stand, but I've added that then.
Yeah.
Then okay.
Yeah, and Margie, my only maybe comment with the bullet point now is I don't want to make it too kind of like, where everyone's trying to get their lawyers to review the language. I think our intent would be to issue an RFI to evaluate dispatchable resources, and of course we're then going to incorporate them into our next IRP. So we would have the whole public stakeholder policy again. I think maybe just scrap that just so we're not nitpicking at exact language there.
And so, Jeffrey, does that address your question?
As long as we're not prematurely eliminating alternatives just because they happen to produce carbon, even though you're obviously gonna do something to minimize the carbon output ultimately. As long as you're not eliminating options at this early stage, I think that's okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and my thought there was we would issue the RFI, Margie, next IRP and the next go around, we would like to, let's just say for argument's sake, we would like to study carbon capture. We could incorporate that into the RFI. Likewise, if we wanted to incorporate SMRs, we can include that into the RFI.
Great, okay. Any objection to putting that topic and that action into the common item category? Okay, I'm going to put it there.
But I would like to add a caveat that if we're doing RFIs, they must do a cradle to generation through generation assessment of carbon. It can include removal as well, but I certainly ascribe to the Ben Franklin's saying an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Gotcha.
So,
okay.
So does that mean that you would also include the carbon emissions necessary to, for example, produce turbine or wind blades?
If that's what it takes, but then you'd also have to include, all the carbon emissions from transportation, from extraction, from everything else. And that would be a more fair apples to apples comparison. And that would also include, when you're doing SMRs, you need to include the extraction problems. Here in New Mexico, it is very, very obvious that in the far northwest corner, the Navajo Nation has taken on the worst brunt of it. And the government has not taken that into consideration. And we need to, as in the future, take that into consideration. as well as disposal. So in that case, I would say to grave.
That just on the surface, that sounds like a very massive undertaking.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there. I think, when we're talking about issuing the RFI is just really to help with our next IRP. So really when we do our generic modeling in the next IRP prior to issuing a subsequent RFP to get some pricing signals, some technical characteristics, our intent isn't to do a full-blown analysis on the RFI. To Jeff's point there, that would be a large undertaking. That would be more appropriate to do in the next IRP cycle.
I think the RFI could have whoever's submitting the RFI include that information in their RFI.
Yeah, we're more than happy to ask for it. I just, like I said, we're going to have a lot to do with the IRP and the RFP. I don't want to commit to doing too much of an analysis, checking data submissions, but we can certainly ask for that information.
So, Athena, I'm going to capture your idea in the stakeholder list that is really that include a cradle to grave carbon analysis in future IRPs. Is that acceptable? I know.
Can you include not just carbon but environmental if you're going to do it to grade? I mean, environmental, including carbon, I guess, emissions.
This is Cynthia for staff, and Athena, I really appreciate what you're getting to, and I fully support cradle to grave analysis, though I don't think it's appropriate at this time in this place. And if we asked in the RFI and even in the RFP for bidders to provide that information, for them to actually do a decent job with that information and data would be incredibly onerous. And otherwise, I think it's going to just be sort of borrowed speculative. And one thing we could do in the future, and I don't want to put this as an action item at all, but there is analysis out there that provides some of the cradle to grave analysis on sort of a generic or aggregate generic basis. And at some point, it might be interesting to have that included in a discussion.
Margie, can I offer a couple thoughts here? Maybe, well, one, raising this because our commission a few years ago was asked to do a similar study as a result of the Supreme Court's decision here. And what we did was commission an independent study by our local university to look at specific life cycle emissions of different energy generation technologies. So I think what I'm offering here, Athena, is this, that more broadly, if your concern is to make sure there's some independent analysis that can be used in future decision making, that's an avenue. Your suggestion is to have some sort of independent study look at that, and maybe not necessarily tie it up to, an RFI that SPS is putting out, or some of these others, because those entities themselves will have they're going to tell you their technology is great, right? So I would be a little careful about how, you tie these together and who's doing the work. But I guess my suggestion is your stakeholder suggestions have some sort of independent New Mexico specific analysis that can help all stakeholders of the next IRP. I guess, let me offer that.
There are things in here.
I do agree that an independent analysis is probably appropriate, and I'm not sure it has to be redone. I am pretty sure like EPA or NREL or some of the other national labs might have already done some preliminary work. And I'm not looking necessarily for very specifics, but for an honest revelation of it, rather than finding out years later from that the scientists have been fed incorrect information. So I think that's a great suggestion, is to do a third party. Not for the next IRA. I would like to see it in the RFI, even if it's just a minor addition for when you look at these, just to keep it at the top of your mind. We've shoved climate change to the back of the bus for too long.
So let me just, okay, so the reason our commissioned that is that it was because of state law, a requirement of our regulatory decisions to consider life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in all these different supply side decisions. So we got into, we asked a third party to help identify what the life cycle emissions factors are, and then that was able, now the commission was able to factor that into decisions. I would just offer, that's not clear to me that that's a requirement of the PRC today. I think you're asking that SPS take that on in some of their analysis. I would just offer, have the basis of that is some sort of third party assessment that folk can get together and review and, decide what they agree or disagree on.
Sounds like a great piece of legislation. If you can point me to what the original legislation was that prompted it, I will make sure that we possibly get that done this next time.
We can talk about it another time. With the original legislation was not very well crafted. That's why we had Supreme Court decisions. But again, I'm offering, like, the way our commission dealt with it again was to have, third party consistent set of emissions factors developed through that study, and then that it gets incorporated into final decision making, which then the utility has to factor in it as well, because it is a part of any, basically, if you look at any of our most recent power purchase agreement or review and approvals, there's a significant life cycle greenhouse gas emissions section and portion of the analysis. So anyway, I guess, this is I'm just trying to help craft your suggestion here in a way that is, able for folks to execute on and have, some of the information that you're looking for. So it's up to SPS how they can, would consider that.
Thank you, Jay. And just for clarification, by our, do you mean the New Mexico?
Sorry, let me, oh, go ahead, Marge. Yeah, I would say you can make New Mexico specific factors. We used generic, basically used NREL information and then looked at Hawaii specific factors. I think you could do something similar there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So the way I've captured it, Athena, and the stakeholder side, conduct an independent analysis of life cycle emissions relevant to New Mexico electric utilities. Do you like that?
Can you add it as per state legislation?
We don't have that legislation.
Well, look into it. Can you just put that note?
Yeah.
As in previous situation or legislation, I'm sure you can craft.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And recognizing that this is a bigger topic than just SPF. Yeah.
Oh, most certainly.
Yeah, it is. That's why I put New Mexico electric utilities writ large. Yeah. Oh, great discussion. Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Margie, can you just note, since it's in the common items for the RFI, can you do a parenthetical that this is under SPS internal consideration still, just to allow us the room to work through the mechanics of it and discuss with corporate management as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and of course our goal today is just to recognize that there's there's interest by, if you guys have mentioned it and stakeholders have mentioned it, there's interest in it. So putting it in the common warrants your further consideration. Yeah, great. So let's shift to, and the way I've color coded this, I kind of put some themes together. I'd like to come back in a moment to the reliability, resiliency, and affordability conversation. But before that, I would like to ask Jay, maybe you have some thoughts about facilitating this next piece, which is to give some more color to the demand response options. Obviously, there's interest from both stakeholders at SPS in furthering this. I'm not sure we have enough detail to craft an action plan item. So could we have some more discussion with your help, Jay, on this?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that my observation here, trying to align the various things, the various different things that we've heard from stakeholders with the bullet point that SPS has offered, under evaluate demand response options, that could, that's a large umbrella potentially. And we've heard at least, I think, 5 different more specific actions or requests from stakeholders. I think Michael Kenny had offered 3 different areas on energy efficiency, time of use rates, and a dispatchable DR program. PRC staff has offered a couple different ideas with variations. So I guess I see all of those as potentially fitting under the evaluate demand response options. So maybe, I guess, I first ask SPS folks on how, what, if you could flesh that out a little bit on, what you see fitting under there, what you see, the scope of that would be during this action plan. And 2, I guess I also offer to everyone, I think you want to think through more than just the evaluation. What happens after that? What is, it says seek or request regulatory approval where appropriate, but can you be more specific on, when you think that would be appropriate and trigger action? So let me, I guess if I look to Zoe or Brooke first, can you help unpack your last item here and see how much what's been offered today fits under there?
Sorry, Jay, I'm trying to read what's on the slide and it just keeps moving. So it's
Sorry, I was trying to make it visible. It should be static now, Zoe, sorry.
okay. I guess I'll take this a little bit out of order from what you asked, Jay, but in terms of request regulatory approval where appropriate, for those, whatever the DR program is that Excel and stakeholders, in engagement with stakeholders, decide is appropriate for the company to execute on. We are a regulated utility, so we'll have to get regulatory approval for those programs. Now, that could be through our energy efficiency triennial filing. That I'm trying to remember, I believe our next triennial will be filed in 2025. Someone please chime in and let me know whether that's incorrect.
Correct.
Is that correct, Jeremy?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
It'll be filed in May of 25 for years 26, 27, and 28.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I'm glad to see you on. So if you want to kind of discuss some more program specific considerations, I'm happy to hand it over to you. But that would be a regulatory filing, Jay, that many of those programs could fall under. Also, as many stakeholders here know, because we've been engaging with them already, SPS is already developing an interruptible credit option that it'll bring forward to the commission likely this year. and asking for approval. So I guess where it says where appropriate is if we're going to be offering these programs, we're going to need to get regulatory approval once they've been developed and fleshed out with stakeholders and developed and put into a regulatory application filing, Jay.
Okay, that's helpful. I guess on the first part, just trying to understand, right, you've heard more specific requests or at least topic areas that stakeholders have offered. Do you see those as fitting under the broader umbrella of evaluate demand response options? And is that, I mean, granted, you guys are taking this feedback in to finalize your set of action plan items. I guess, do you see those as potentially aligned and consistent, or are there's items under there that seem that were not what you were thinking, in crafting that?
I don't think anything was not in alignment, Jay.
Okay, I guess, how can we help move this forward? I guess is the best question, right? You've heard a lot of ideas and enthusiasm from the group here. The list here suggests you're open to it. So I guess, the thought is I guess between yourselves and stakeholders, what would be the best process steps probably SPS could propose in their action plan that would address these items?
Yeah, I think, and Jeremy, please chime in if you don't agree with me. But I think that the energy efficiency filing in 2025 is a good place to do the evaluation that we're talking about and then decide what's appropriate to bring forth for regulatory approval. So I think that would probably be, that's one very obvious process that I can see, Jay.
Yeah, and I agree
that's within the action plan period. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry, Jeremy.
Between Michael and Cynthia, is that consistent with some of the ideas that you guys offered?
This is Michael. So, I mean, the next plan will be filed in 2025. Is that correct?
That's correct, Michael. We'll do the filing in May of, of course, rule states that you file it by May of 2025. So we'll come in and start doing stakeholder engagement middle of next year for that particular filing. We have been working with SWEEP and other stakeholders on looking at an ICO tariff that is kind of a byproduct of several things, one being rate case, one being the need, of course, a huge need for an ICO tariff down there. So we are looking at proposing a case really quickly that would kind of launch an ICO tariff down there to start looking at interest. We've provided testimony before in a grid mod case under Mark Schoenheider on really where demand response falls into Mexico. Of course, energy efficiency is where we would like to see it, right? There's the funds there through the statute, and of course the statute does provide a space in a house and a home for demand management. But I think other options, when we look at dynamic rate pricing and things like that, I think a lot of that falls on grid mod, and when that implementation will be in, and looking at future grid modernization filings that the company may have. So also say, I think that there's some demand management that definitely falls in energy efficiency as we look at some more of the more dynamic things that other, some of our sister companies are looking at. Those may, end up falling in a grid mod case or potentially a rate case. The problem that we're seeing now, I think, and we've kind of expressed this with stakeholders, is that in order for things to go through energy efficiency, they have to be cost effective. And there's some barriers that we see there, and I could go on and on through a separate conversation on that. But there are some barriers that we face, and so as we start to look at these programs and kind of figure out which box they need to go in for regulatory approval, it will be kind of a group effort to determine where those are going to kind of be housed and live in. But obviously, like Zoe said, the first thing we'll be doing is looking at an ICO option. We just recently, this spring, received approval for that small business thermostat program. So that is launching and getting up to speed now. So we are working on it. We understand there's a need, but where exactly is still a little bit unknown, especially given, a lot of these moving parts, this IRP being one of them, which will play into, of course, the next EE filing, triennial filing that we do.
And Jeremy, I'm glad you brought up grid modernization because that's another regulatory process that this could fit into, Jay.
Absolutely.
SPS is currently is waiting for a resolution of the grid modernization case application that it has in front of the commission. We had a hearing on that December of last year. And we are also waiting to see whether the commission it will be holding a workshop this month, but whether it'll ultimately open up a rulemaking. So there's a lot of moving parts, right, when it comes to grid modernization and what the commission ultimate expectations of the commission will be when it comes to those filings. But that is certainly another avenue for these programs. There's a lot going on right now that will affect timing of that. So we know for sure that a energy efficiency triennial filing will be made in 2025, but I can't tell you with certainty when our next grid modernization application will be filed, when we're still waiting approval on our last one.
This is Cynthia for staff, and what I'm hearing is that maybe we want an action item to incorporate the contributions and results from the grid modernization and energy efficiency / demand response proceedings as available and as developed, something like that. I don't think we want to take on as action items that we form an additional stakeholder group of some sort that works on these matters when we have the grid mod, the EE and DR proceedings. But we want to have the results and contributions of those proceedings explicitly incorporated.
And just for my own clarification, the grid mod, is that just for particular projects or is this an overarching plan?
The current SPS grid modernization application that's in front of the commission right now is for implementation of advanced metering infrastructure. It's not an overall like distribution system plan, Athena, if that's what you're asking.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Okay, that's all been, oh, go ahead.
So, Cynthia, if you have access to the chat, can you put your action plan recommendation in the chat? And 'cause I'm not sure I captured it. So that's one request on this demand response topic. My question also then to staff is your suggestion about reducing oil and gas connected load through voluntary programs or special service contracts. Would that be incorporated in this evaluation or would it be separate?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so there was one of your recommended action plans was an analysis or study of how to reduce oil and gas
Right.
through voluntary programs and or special service contracts. So my question is, does that fit within the topic that we're discussing about evaluating demand response options? That
no, we'd like to have that as a separate call out.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, thank you.
And the same with our study of interruptible tariffs for high tech and other loads.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, if you could, your wording about incorporating the results of the proceedings on grid mod and energy efficiency, that would be helpful if you put that in chat if you have a moment, please. Thank you. Back to you, Jay.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sense of the pieces here. I'm not sure how much, I I guess maybe let me just ask it this way, and this is to Zoe and team. Like, have you heard enough feedback here? I think there's still a lot of alignment. I'm not sure you like the language here crafted covers everything, or people necessarily want it to be pinned down that way, but I feel like there's you're expressing an interest and commitment to evaluating these options, and I'm sorry, SPSs will evaluate and implement where it makes sense. I was working on this in a number of different proceedings. I did hear Cynthia say there's not interested in forming a separate stakeholder group to do this. So I guess on the spot, it's hard to know exactly the language here to have a common theme, but I guess the SPS, now that you've seen this feedback, you know, you have a month now to consider it and reach out to people on your own. And do you feel like that's sufficient, or do you have further questions?
I don't have any questions right now, Jay. Thanks. This conversation's been helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess on the stakeholder side, are there further details you want to articulate or requests you want to make under this demand side management umbrella? Okay, not really hearing anything, Margie. So I think we've gotten the pieces on the table, and we'll see how things can assemble in the next couple months.
Yeah, and we can certainly have a quick a review conversation on this when we meet on October 3rd, right? We can get an update from your team, Zoe, on what the thinking is to date when we have that conversation on this topic, knowing that there's been this contribution and input from stakeholders. So we can certainly come back to that, as well as the conversation about how reliability, resiliency, and affordability actions will be, considered. So I think those are two topics to revisit on October 3rd, if that makes sense to you, Zoe.
It does. That was kind of my understanding of how this process was working anyway. So thanks, Margie.
Okay. And thank you, Cynthia, for putting your addition. I will put that in the document as well. Thank you. So you all can see that the wording Cynthia's got incorporate the contributions from the SPS grid mod and EEDR proceedings into the IRP. And those will be based on the schedule of those proceedings as they evolve. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to add that. Okay.
Yeah, maybe fix my spelling.
That's okay. We'll get that. Don't worry. We got the content, which is critical. So I think we've come as far as we might be able to in this conversation. The plan is that we'll make this document available to you all as part of the results of this meeting, and feel free to review it in preparation for the next conversation on October 3rd, which would be our last discussion about this. Let me ask if there are any further comments, any other inspiration that stakeholders have had in this conversation, the things that we've clearly missed, or oversights, or contributions you wanted to add to this action plan list, knowing it's not perfect, but we want to capture all the topics before we enter the very last couple weeks of this process. So any other comments?
Margie, Cynthia, just so I understand the staff items that are in the stakeholder category on oil and gas, interruptible, and then PPA extensions, those are still being considered by SPS, is that right? And they're not adopting those or embracing those yet to the common item category?
I don't think we've heard comment on that. Zoe, correct me if I'm wrong.
So I think Brooke and Cynthia had that conversation earlier, how SPS is planning on considering extensions. And my apologies for that not making the list in SPS items, but I'm fine with that being put on common items.
Good catch. Thank you. Okay,
It's
thanks.
It's
the
not
first,
just, yeah. So go ahead, Jay.
I was saying it's the first bullet, right?
Yeah, I think
Right.
there's there. And then explore
Well.
PPA extensions. I think there's two part. I think Brooke kind of said it pretty eloquently. There's two parties to this. So SPS certainly will, in the RFP, will consider seriously any bids that would extend current PPAs.
I guess
But it's not under our control whether those get bid into the RFP or not.
my comment on that at the time was when you look at the definition all source, you're saying that fits in there.
Yes,
right?
that's
And
correct.
so
That's
that'll
correct.
be defined and fleshed out there. But that's
Yeah, so I think that's
concept.
captured already. I don't think it needs to be, it can maybe be like a sub bullet under all source RFP. But like including PPA extensions. But all source, I think it captures that, Jay.
Well, it may be implicitly, okay, thank you.
Is that,
I guess I'm curious why some of these bullet points under SPS items that are like process and regulatory related that we're going to have to do no matter what are still under just SPS and not common. Is there?
Just because I haven't moved them yet.
Okay, I was a little concerned that maybe there was still disagreement that we needed to get like CCN and PPA approval.
They're now, yeah, got them. Thanks. I just hadn't moved them, Zoe, because I wanted the conversation first of people, and we did that.
Okay.
And same question from us over here at staff about our studies on oil and gas and interruptible tariffs. Can those be moved to the common category now?
I guess I would offer, Cynthia, I was trying to ask if you thought they fit under this evaluate demand response options. And
No,
you see it
no, I think they're much more specific.
Okay.
Cynthia, this is Jeremy. Can you explain a little bit more on the differences you see there, just so that I understand? And
On which one, Jeremy?
on the differences between oil and gas voluntary load reduction and then just kind of baking it into that common item. It does fit into kind of the overall demand response. So I was just checking to see.
Well, voluntary programs, including the special service contracts. I don't know if you were on earlier when Ed was talking about some of the options there to actually do dedicated projects to serve that load directly.
Yeah, if you're looking at special service contract, you'd actually carve out the project from the rate base, and that would allow the project to have a review by the commission and basically look at the PPA and look at the interconnection and so forth, and just make sure that there's not any other customer implications. And it's, we've seen it before, and it's been used for serving server load primarily, and it just might be another option that might be attractive to oil and gas services. And it has the added benefit of not having an impact on the rate base. So,
and that last point is really important about the context on this, because staff is very concerned about the upper end of the forecast range of resource need based on the electrification load associated with the oil and gas electrification. So we really are very interested in looking at this, ASAP as reasonably possible.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
This is Austin Rushoff with the New Mexico Large Customer Group. Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Absolutely.
And maybe this is staff or just more broadly, but you know, we don't dispute that a lot of the projected load growth comes from the oil and gas industry. And I think it makes sense to maybe look at potential special service contracts there. But I guess one concern I have is I don't know that we need to direct this bullet directly to the oil and gas industry. I think it could maybe be more broadly with just saying new or expanded industrial load growth. Directing it to a specific industry raises some concerns about, you know, discriminatory rates and things of that nature. So I think if that was just a more broad analysis, that'd be more appropriate.
Yeah, the point's well taken, and I think the idea is not to discriminate against any group. And I think we just were following it in lines of the way this analysis has been presented in terms of segregating out that particular load. But yeah, we're actually looking for solutions here that maybe, you know, will provide better solutions for that group and others. So your point's well taken.
Yeah, I think maybe if we just change the O and G to, you know, new or expanding large industrial, or a phrase like that might be a little more appropriate.
So yeah, let's clarify that, because I asked about that in this meeting. Specifically, I was called out to that. So I guess since Cynthia and Ed, this was your action item, are you okay with the change in that wording? And if so, what would you like to change to?
Well, it shows up in all the analysis that's being done by SPS. So I guess it's just not our decision in terms of how we want to clarify that.
The electric, yeah, I mean, you can add and other.
It's electrification load, is that better?
I mean, the electrification load or the electrification